Hey guys, this is Ben, and I'm kind of a little bit excited to be talking about this in this video because this is something that I've noticed for a long time, and like it's called scientism, and I've it's like you talk to these people and they seem quite bright sometimes, but like they don't seem to understand the huge philosophical problems with like their position, and it's like they dance around to like different philosophical problems, and they they think of science as something that it's not, and they don't see sort of the problems. And so for me, it's just been very comforting that to learn about the different categories of problems. And so when it comes to scientism, what is it? Well, first of all, it's an epistemological view. It's an epistemology, which means it is an idea about how you can know things, about the way to know things. So that's what epistemology is. Also, scientism can be usually it's also an ontology. And an ontology is your idea about what actually exists. And so, epistemologically, someone is into scientism when they still hold to verificationism, even though it was debunked in the 1950s, and it only really existed from the 1920s to the 1950s. So if you still hold to verificationism today, you're like some sort of fundamentalist that just won't let go of something that's been clearly debunked. And then when it comes to ontologically, if you still hold to naturalism or philosophical materialism, well, you're probably into scientism. You're in the scientism camp. Although there are people who aren't into the scientism camp that might still hold to philosophical materialism. So, but if you still hold to verificationism, then yeah, you're like a fundamentalist. Like you are someone who just, I was born and raised, taught this, and I don't care what you say. Anyone disagrees with me, they're all part of the big conspiracy, type thing. Or, some sort of just true believer. Okay, so verificationism is the idea that a statement can be verified as true only empirically by using the five senses, or some sort of tool that augments our five senses, some sort of measuring tool. So like even the basic tape measure helps you judge a distance. Microscope, telescope, scales. These all augment your basic senses, but ultimately it's all empiricism is the use of the senses, and then to gain knowledge. Verificationism is the idea that empiricism is the only way to test propositions. So like if I say to you that it's raining, then you have to go outside or use some sort of measuring tool. You can only verify that empirically. Okay. So that and the idea, and what verificationism says is any statement that cannot be verified empirically is like a nonsense statement, or not a meaningful statement. Or technically they say it literally is meaningless. That it's like, so the best you can do is say something that's just totally, who knows, or it can be some sort of just like tautological statement, which is like a circular statement, not a circular reasoning, but just a circular statement. So like they would say, it's all under the category of like, 1 + 1 = 2, is tautological in the sense that like you're just saying 1 + 1, and then 2 is just a restatement of what 1 + 1 is. So like that, verificationism would say that like all math is just like writing. You start with something on paper and then you just rewrite it in different ways, and that's all that all of math is. The only real information you're bringing to the table is what you can verify empirically. So there's that. And then Naturalism or philosophical materialism is the idea that the physical material world is all that there is, or that there's no supernatural. So ultimately that would be the idea that everything boils down to some sort of physical component part, and everything is made of some sort of physical component parts. So like there would be no supernatural. And so you have to have some sort of distinction by what you mean between like a a physical object and or some sort of supernatural entity. At the very bare bones, you would have to say that a physical component operates according to its inherent physical properties, and so it has some sort of properties. So like water will put out a fire because of the physical properties of fire and the physical properties of water. And what you can't have in naturalism or philosophical materialism is there can be no free will in any of that. You just can't have it in there, because that wouldn't, if an entity functions according to its properties, then its properties are what they are, and they always directly cause or determine what the entity does. So it can't ever say maybe I'll do this and maybe I'll do that. If you expand, it can have a lot of properties that make it, really complicated in how it interacts with the world. But that's it could be a big physical system of some sort, but like that still doesn't introduce free will. It would just be indistinguishable from free choice. Truly free will would mean that like what you do is not necessarily what's in your properties. In other words, like I may do this, I may do that. If what I do is simply defined by the component properties of me, then like I'm always going to do this because the properties always are what they are, So if there is a true either or point, a true free choice, then there you go. So that's a real bare bones definition of verificationism and philosophical materialism. And scientism, typically is a dedication to these two things. So verificationism has a huge problem with it, and the reason it died in the 50s, and the reason it got changed to scientism, as a derogatory term. Well, let's just go through. Now, one of the problems is, the biggest problem is that verificationism refutes itself. It's self-refuting. It's, in other words, you cannot empirically verify verificationism. That's the biggest problem with it. The idea that the only statements that can be considered meaningful are ones that can be empirically verified cannot be empirically verified. And that's why it died. It's purely based on philosophical reasoning, so it has to be judged on those grounds. Another problem with it is you still, and this is one of the philosophers of science have talked about, I think Karl Popper, he said, where do you get the statements that you decide to empirically verify? The propositions, the theories, the hypotheses, the guesses. Where do those come from? He says they may as well come, you may as well dream them up in a dream while you're sleeping in the bed. Because so this is an intrinsic part of where the knowledge comes from, and yet it's totally outside of this system. And that's really relevant. Like what is intuition? We don't know. Verificationism just verifies our intuitions, but we don't know where we get the intuitions from. That's a problem. The other problem is that, and this is a different problem, but that the island of scientific knowledge always moves as we gather new data, and so it's not a safe, stable island. It's always in motion, and it's always moving. And so it's not really certain knowledge, because you always have a little bit of fluke data that doesn't fit the model or the theory or whatever, and you just disregard it as measurement goofs. But then you find out later, if you keep having a bunch of that fluke data, you have to have what I think Popper called a paradigm shift. He says that it creates an inertia of ideas, or what he called, I think, cognitive dissonance, until eventually it causes a paradigm shift. So, for an example of this would be, a few years back I heard that scientists had measured some neutrinos moving faster than light across a thing, but it turned out to be fluke data. It turned out that there were just some loose wires in there, and it was just an error in the measurements, you know. And so that's an example of fluke data. Another problem with this is that, like, logical truths are actually, you actually can, I mean, if you understand the basic philosophy, I mean, like, you can know truths about reality based on pure philosophical reasoning or logical truths. I'll give you, my favorite example is just like, you know, let's it's similar to the one about the neutrinos moving faster than light. Let's say that you take a suitcase and you put 3 watches in it, you seal it up real well, and you seal it in a trunk, and you record everything, and you drive like 200 miles, and you open everything up, and there's 4 watches in there. Okay, what you would not conclude is that 3 actually equals 4. You would not conclude that your observations have overridden science or overridden, have overridden logic and philosophical reasoning and math. You know what I mean? So that's a problem. Sometimes people in the scientism camp will say that science is like omnipotent and can answer all questions, which is of course ridiculous. There are numerous, and that's one of the problems with verificationism. What it does is it takes various fields and it just says that they're totally meaningless. But like, science can't account for, it can't defend or prove mathematics. It simply has to assume mathematics. It also has to assume a moral system about, you know, science can't really give us a moral system. Science can give you hydrogen bombs, which can, you know, we could kill millions of people, and it can give you, you know, better fertilizers for your crops, you know, or medicines. You know, science is, it's not inherent in science to give you moral commands. It's just like understanding how things work, and if you want to do this, this is a way you can do it, you know, and this is how it works. You know, it can tell you what you can do, it can't tell you what you should do, I guess. That's an easy way of drawing that distinction. So, this idea that, you know, the idea that statements can only be trusted or considered meaningful if they can be empirically verified, well, that's just simply, I mean, fundamentally it's self-refuting. Because what you're doing is you're making a broad sweeping generalization. The idea that a statement can only be trusted if it's empirically verified, that's verificationism. Where did you get that idea? How do you verify that idea? You verify with your reasoning. You're gonna go to give me some sort of philosophical reasoning, but you're not empirically verifying it. You know, and if you were empirically verifying it, then you'd run to the problem of, that'd be logically absurd, wouldn't it? You know, because you'd be using circular reasoning. You would be saying, you know, I trust my senses because I trust my senses, because my senses say so. You know, I know I can only trust my senses because I can only, you know, and they don't really even say that. And then, of course, you can actually, you know, figure out truths about reality and verify propositions with, you know, with sheer logical reasoning. So, like, what you can do is say things that, like, well, clearly, logically, you know, A, B, and C are actually the only possible options. So I'll give you an example of that. So philosophical materialism is the other thing we're talking about. Essentially, it boils down to, like, all sorts of problems. So, but, well, you know, we'll get that in a minute. Let's just back up a little bit. Basically, when it comes to proving things with sheer logic, you can use deduction and say, like, well, these are the only possible options, A, B, and C. And if they really are the only possible options, then you can say, okay, this one, let's examine A and B, And you may realize that there's something that makes A truly impossible and something that makes B truly impossible. And then you would say, okay, C. So, an example would be like, there exists no universe where, 1 plus 1 doesn't make 2. Has to be true for all universes. And you will never get an observation in any universe that overrides it, ever, anywhere. And most of the arguments for the existence of God actually function this way. They function in terms of pure logical reasoning. Essentially, all you're doing is you're saying reality exists because, logically, like that's a good question. Like, how do we know that there's any such thing as reality or anything exists at all? Well, if nothing existed, there would, we wouldn't be able to make any observations of anything. So like, based on pure logical reasoning, we can say that with, the simplest, most fundamental observation, what's called properly basic observations, like the fact that I observe anything ever, it can all be an illusion, but that's not important. The important thing is, like, I couldn't even observe illusions if nothing existed. Okay, and you understand that purely logically. So, like, the idea that there is no existence is clearly wrong. So there's a good, good example. Okay, all right. So now philosophical materialism is the other sort of, this other wing of scientism that also has some big problems. Scientism runs into a problem here because philosophical materialism runs into something called reductionism. And reductionism is just one problem. So, reductionism is the idea that all of our thoughts, beliefs, choices, and actions reduce to, brain chemistry or different brain states. No matter how complicated those brain states might be. Now, the problem here, the problems are actually numerous. But that would mean that, like, when somebody commits a crime, they didn't actually choose to commit a crime because there's no choice in that system. It was just a complicated interaction of various physical components. And so you could simply reprogram them to not do that. Of course, the only reason you would be reprogramming them to not do that is because of your, brain chemistry, of your physical components in your brain. And who's to say that, like, your, how your brain is functioning is superior to how their brain is functioning? Why is that in one any better than the other? In fact, all of your thoughts, ponderings on this, are really just different brain chemical reactions. Okay, so there's some inherent problems with this. One of the basic questions we have to start asking ourselves is, like, okay, how do I know if any of my beliefs are true or false? How do I know if my beliefs are true? Well, if philosophical materialism is correct, you don't actually know if any of your beliefs are true. Because the chemicals may react to give you false beliefs. Certainly not impossible, right? For people to believe things that aren't actually true. So, like, the chemicals may react to give you false beliefs. Alright, so here's the thing. You could say, and this is kind of the easiest way to demonstrate the problem, you could say that, well, evolution has done its job over billions of years, or hundreds of millions of years, and given me true beliefs. Because if I, in other words, like, let's go back to our evolutionary history, and if there exists somewhere along the line some creature that, like, can't tell the difference between a chicken and a lion, well, I think that creature is going to die out. Whereas a creature that has true beliefs, that believes a lion is truly what it is and a chicken is truly what it is, will be much more likely to survive. And so the idea is that evolution will have a natural selection, that there's a survivability value in having true beliefs. Now one of the problems there is that sometimes false beliefs have survivability value. Oftentimes it helps your survival to believe lies. Like ignorance is bliss, as they say. You can think of lots of examples actually. But more importantly, where did you get the theory of evolution? This is a philosophical problem. Where did you get the theory of evolution? Well, it's just an idea in your head. It's a belief you hold. The chemical reactions in your head gave you the theory of evolution. So why should you trust the chemical reactions in your head? Because the chemical reactions in your head gave you the theory of evolution, and it proves it. So you're trusting the chemical reactions because the chemical reactions say so. This is no different from saying that, I know the Bible's true because the Bible says so. And so, all knowledge is circular reasoning under philosophical materialism. So that's why that's one of the reasons you get this derogatory term called scientism to openly mock this idea. And it's kind of funny because it refutes science itself, but which is like, scientism's it's born out of a big dedication to science, but it actually winds up refuting science. So like in science, it's very important that your beliefs are true, that your beliefs are accurate, that your measurements are accurate, that that you're doing good science, honest science, real science, factual science. But if you don't know if any of your thoughts are actually true or not, then you're not doing science. And so what you have to do as a scientist is, when you go into the science lab, you have to take your belief in philosophical materialism, lock it in a box, and pretend you don't hold it, so that you can do science. And actually, there's no way you can function as a scientist without belief in the freedom to control what you believe, a free choice. And we call that a soul or a spirit, and it's a highly questionable thing, but it's clearly it can't function as a physical entity. So you can't believe in science, you can't do science without believing in a soul. As soon as you debate someone and question, or just ask yourself what is actually true, you are defying philosophical materialism. Now, this runs us in right into the final thing we need to talk about, the whole God of the gaps question. So what you run into, a weird thing for people in the scientism camp, is they kind of talk out of one side of their mouth of one thing, and the other side of their mouth another thing. And so out of one side of their mouth they say they don't like philosophical proofs for God's existence that require a lot of reasoning and thinking. They prefer they want God to perform a miracle, because they're verificationists, and that's how they verify, does God exist? Well, I observe God, or I observe some sort of miracle, and then that would, verify it. And part of the problem there is that it wouldn't actually verify it, and so they say that out of one side of their mouth, but out of the other side of the mouth, they bring a reason why that wouldn't verify anything. It's called the God of the gaps problem. Maybe there's something more to how science functions and how the natural world functions that we don't yet understand, and that would explain the miracle without saying that God did it, and just say that, so anything that we observe, maybe it was just some sort of aspect of the physical world that we did not yet understand, and it wasn't a supernatural, transcendent, all-powerful, divine, all-knowing creator. It wasn't the supernatural. Although the supernatural would have to exist, for you to be thinking, and to have knowledge. And that you do have knowledge because these are basic fundamental principles of reason. So even if everything you see is an illusion, you still see the illusion, and so there must be some reality. That was just one aspect of philosophical reasoning we talked about already, and this to be the case. And so you couldn't know this to be the case if reductionism was true and all of your thoughts were just chemical reactions. And so, but it's clear that you can directly observe reality in that way, you know. And so reductionism must not be true, and that means that you must have a soul, because it's something to think about. I'm trying to think of how to say this very quickly, but what it boils down to is, you know, the basic fundamental forms of knowledge, and this is what we talk about in the philosophy departments, you know, a posteriori or a priori knowledge. The basic fundamental knowledge that you have is that you see something. You subjectively see something. But you can use that to make the leap into facts about reality to some degree, because you can say that if I observe two ideas, like there's no reality and all of the observations I make of things, you can observe that those two ideas are different. You don't have to actually, they could both be, like, in other words, like, it doesn't even matter if they're made up ideas. You still know that the made up ideas contradict one another. And, you know, even if, you know, all of the reality that you observe empirically is an illusion, you still know that it contradicts the idea that nothing exists. And you don't have to, like, really reason that out. You're just observing two ideas directly, subjectively. But that subjective experience is an experience of ideas that allows you to make that leap into, say, that, like, I know that both of these can't be true. And so that's, you know, that's the law of non-contradiction, and it's one of the fundamental proofs of the fourth law of reason, the principle of rational inference, that we do clearly have the ability to rationally infer and know things to be true. And so that wouldn't function, you know, without free choice. And I think, honestly, the experience of free will should be sort of properly basic, I think. You know, it's basic. Like, of course you have free will. Do you not experience making choices all the time? In other words, like, if you have free will, would there be any way for you to not know that you have free will? You know? In other words, if you control what you do, then would there be any way for you to not know that you control what you do? But anyway, so we get back to this question of the God of the gaps, and that's, you know, that's the final one we want to take a look at. And so people say, you know, that God, he keeps getting relegated to the mysteries that science hasn't answered. The problem with that, some of the problems with that should become obvious already. The arguments for God are fundamentally philosophical, some of the best ones anyway. So, but if these people are verificationists, then they just say, well, all of that doesn't matter. But then they're refuting themselves, because they're saying all of that doesn't matter based on philosophical grounds. But you can't reject philosophy for philosophical reasons and then call yourself a scientist. Yeah. Okay, so that's the problem with verificationism. It's a philosophical argument that rejects all philosophy. You can't empirically verify the idea that everything can be empirically verified, or, you know, all knowledge must be empirically verified. Okay, so that's one problem. The other problem is that a theology that includes an all-powerful God, an all-knowing God, a transcendent God, a totally great God, would actually drive you to explain things in terms of natural causes. So this is what the scholastic monks and some of the ancient, even the Greek philosophers, I think they might have actually started the idea. It's called secondary causation, because these earlier Greek philosophers actually came through their philosophical reasoning to believe in God, although they had a lot of philosophical disputes. But in the Middle Ages, this whole question of secondary causation, which is what they came up with, took on a much more sacred, holy sense as Christianity, you know, really settled the theological disputes of the early Greek and Roman period. And so what you have is secondary causation is the idea that God causes and controls everything that happens through secondary causes. So in other words, it's like dominoes. God started A, but he knew that A would cause B, cause C, cause D, and ultimately cause G. So, like, for example, the parting of the Red Sea, maybe that was caused by some sort of natural phenomenon that we do not yet understand. But then what caused that natural phenomenon? What caused that? 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 The idea in secondary causation is that it all goes back to God. Because if God is truly great, then you would want to push God back a step. And so that's the idea, is that the more steps you can push God away from what you observe, then the greater God would have to be. And so a theology that includes a being of maximal greatness would actually drive you and compel you to pursue natural explanations for things. That's the concept of secondary causation, is that that gave rise to the search for natural law, because they were looking for God's basic design plan. They had this idea that there were simple little rules that God came up with, and that everything functions according to those rules, and you can explain everything in terms, and like they felt like if they could find the actual laws of science, that they were reading like God's mind, and it was like a very sacred, holy thing. But my point to you is, if we explain away something like, maybe we find that the Red Sea did part, but it was due to some natural phenomenon, then like we would say, God must be even greater than we thought, because we pushed God back a step. So pushing God back a step doesn't get rid of God. Because it would just mean that God had a bigger, better, larger, more well thought out plan, because he was controlling things from even further back. So ultimately, a truly great God would actually only have to do one thing ever, and that one thing would actually account for everything else that ever happens. And so the larger the system is, then the greater God would have to be to control it. But that wouldn't prove God exists. But like I don't think that like this question of like looking for miracles would necessarily be a great way to prove God exists anyway. But explaining things away in terms of natural explanations would actually be something that good Christian theology, I think, would motivate you to do. Now, I know there's Christians who disagree with me. There's also other Christians who agree with me, like Augustine. Okay. And so it's a difference between preternatural and supernatural. C.S. Lewis, of course, I think he coined the term supernature in his view of miracles. But yeah, so there, my view would, I prefer the view that God caused everything from the beginning, and so it's a higher. My concept of my theology is that it's a higher concept of God when you can explain things and more things in terms of natural causes. That's a bigger and greater God. And that's a very classical view, honestly. I'm not coming at you with some kind of radically new view. Although a lot of Christians favor the view that God intervenes in history when he sees fit. So, but a lot didn't. So anyway, I don't know if there's really much else to say on this. When it comes to proof for God's existence, I'm not against the idea that there could be something miraculous that was observed. So like if we observe that, like, wow, this thing happened and it looks miraculous and it looks like the only explanation is God did it or something supernatural did it, I would say, wow, that's amazing, But then also, if we explain it away in terms of natural phenomenon, then I would say, wow, God would have to be even greater to mastermind all of that, And so I don't think, this is neat. Either which way you go, it doesn't really remove God from the picture. you would remove God from the picture other ways, and the arguments for God's existence are primarily philosophical. So there you go. I mean, that's the realm they lie in, because, and that's one of the main problems with scientism is, like, it's a system that's basically designed to make atheists, you know, because, like, you say that, like, everything, your epistemological system means that the only thing you can believe in is statements that can be empirically verified. So you're looking for miracles to prove God exists. But then out of the other side of your mouth, you say that, you know, well, we, of course, you know, will one day find a natural explanation for this. You know, so, like, you set it up where everything that happens, you know, just verifies atheism. And, you know, it's a self-refuting thing, verificationism. So, I mean, when it comes to the existence of God, of course the proof for God's existence would be primarily philosophical, because all you're really asking is, does reality exist? Yes. And then you go further and you deduce, well, what is the nature of reality? So God wouldn't exist in one spot, in one location, here or there, you know, like, ooh, is there anywhere in the world a red rock that has, like, purple zebra stripes? That wouldn't be God. That's not a good analogy. So then, you know, people make this argument and they say, like, oh, you got to know everything that there is to know to prove for sure that God doesn't exist. I don't know, like, that's not really, that's a verificationist view of things, because that's saying that, like, you go and make observations and to verify, to confirm or falsify, you know, statements about reality. And of course, you hopefully make, you know, in science you make claims about reality that are falsifiable, because you can never observe everything, so they have to have some sort of predictive power to be falsifiable. But when it comes to God, I mean, it's a different question, because you would never not be empirically observing God. If God exists at all places, at all times. He's the foundation of everything that exists. Everything you observe is really God, like, flowing from God, built on God. He's the building block of all reality. So, like, you're never not observing God. Everything, God's in control of, like, everything that happened. Whether you're with me and you think He controls it, you know, preternaturally, you know, from the origin, from as a first cause, as a prime mover, or if you think that God intervenes, you know, all the time. But the thing is, either way, God is not something that's really up for empiricism to verify or falsify. The question is, what is the nature of reality? Because whenever you observe reality, you're observing God. If God is an all-powerful, all-knowing creator of the universe, then everything that exists by His will, by His say-so, by His allowing it. So everything is an expression of God's will. Everything you've ever seen. He exists at all places at all times. Like, you know, so in other words, like, you think about God more than you think about anything else. Even sex and money. Because everything is what it is because of God. If God exists. So, like, God is the, you know, fundamental principle behind all things. So, like, the question is what is the nature of reality? So God ultimately would be more of a philosophical question, because you can't, empirically, the work is quite easy. It's just, is there reality? You know, do you observe anything? And then, well, what is the nature of reality itself? So anyway, I hope this video made sense. I feel like we actually tied a bunch of stuff up in kind of a tidy little package. And for some people out there, this might actually answer a lot of questions. I'm sure there may be other people out there who have, you know, well, you know, they might ask me, like, well, what about multiple gods, or like something like that, or, you know, how do you get to Jesus? That's very common, you know. Well, you didn't prove Jesus. Like, okay, yeah, I didn't prove Jesus. You know, but I think we talked about quite a bit, and I think it's a good stopping point. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time. Hey guys, this is Ben, and there's one little thing I need to add to this video. It's very quick. But I mentioned miracles an issue of how miracles wouldn't really be a good way to prove the existence of God. And you may want to challenge me and say, well, Ben, the Bible says, that Jesus confirmed, miracles were a big part of how they knew that Jesus was sent by God and that kind of thing. It seems that Jesus oftentimes proved what he said by miracles. And I just want to, so since it's so relevant to what we talked about in that video, it's very quick, but the confirmation of Jesus with miracles is actually just part of the fact that he is a Jewish prophet. In the Old Testament Jewish law, it gives a special situation and it gives a special test for whether or not someone is a prophet sent with a message from God. And the test is that if they claim that they're sent from God and they perform miracles, then that means that God actually sent them. It's not done to confirm that God exists. Rather, it is a way to confirm that this is a prophet that God actually sent. And it's actually to Hebrews, to Jews. And it even goes on in the other text, and in the later text, to say that if someone comes in the name of some other god and performs a miracle, God didn't send that one either. So it doesn't even, and so that should make it clear that under this Jewish system, miracles don't prove the existence of God. It even totally allows for for prophets to perform miracles in the names of other gods. So the issue with Jesus is they couldn't, when he came to Jesus, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they couldn't, and the teachers and the scribes and all that, they couldn't debunk the fact that Jesus was clearly performing miracles. And so that means that the only explanation is he must be teaching a different God. Because, the Old Testament said, they can perform miracles in the name of another God. And so the question was, well, is he teaching the correct God? And so then, for the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and all that, the whole question came down to scrutiny about the religious teachings of Jesus. So it was very interesting. It came down to a theological discussion and a biblical discussion, and that's really what it boiled down to. What kind of God was Jesus teaching? And so anyway, that's all. It can get really fascinating as you go from there, but we'll stop there. Just want to point out that miracles, even in the Bible, were never a way to prove the existence of God. Thank you for your time.